Hey, Faith Unfiltered podcast listeners. This is Blake Smith, project manager for Faith Unfiltered podcast. First, let me say Happy New Year to all of you. We hope that your holiday season has been filled with joy and renewal and that you've had time to spend with family and friends making new and precious memories. As you know, we at Faith Unfiltered have been working on changing things up a little. Our hope is to provide more unfiltered content in addition to the content we've been providing for the last 10 years. We've got some exciting things in the works that have taken a little longer to get off the ground than we first expected, but make no mistake, they are coming. We're adding some new hosts to our team and what we believe will be raw and relevant conversations that will meet your needs wherever you are on your spiritual journey. We're kicking off this new year with a two-part no-filter episode in which host Robin Linkhart sits down with guests Nancy Ross and Larissa Kanno-Kindred. This is part one. Robin, take it away.
Hello and welcome to No Filter, a special series from Faith Unfiltered podcast, where we take on the sensitive, sometimes controversial topics that impact our faith and daily lives. I'm your host, Robin Linkhart, and in this series, we're not here to shock, we're here to get real. Because authentic faith asks us to engage with the whole of life, the questions, the struggles, the complexity, and the hope. These conversations are honest, respectful, and occasionally uncomfortable, and that's okay. We're glad you're here. We do want to make a special note that this episode is rated PG-13 and parental guidance is suggested. Our guests today are Nancy Ross and Larissa Kanno-Kindred. Nancy Ross has an MA in art history from the University of St. Andrews, a PhD in the history of art from the University of Cambridge, and an MA in justice and reconciliation from Luther Seminary. She is currently the chair of the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences Department at Utah Tech, where she has been teaching since 2007. Her scholarship looks at the history and sociology of Mormon feminism, LDS garments, and women's ordination in the LDS and RLDS faiths. Community of Christ is now the name that the RLDS Church uses. Nancy also serves as the pastor for Southern Utah Community of Christ Congregation in St. George, Utah. We are delighted to have her with us today to share about her new book, Mormon Garments, Sacred and Secret, co-authored with Jessica Finnegan and Larissa Kanno-Kindred, who is also with us. We are happy to welcome Larissa Kanno-Kindred. She is a PhD student in psychology at Tennessee State University. She has a master's in mental health counseling and a bachelor's in gender and sexuality studies from UMass. Her research focuses on racial socialization, gender dynamics, and how intersecting identities impact relationships. Larissa was born and raised in Utah and currently lives in Nashville with her husband, 3 kids, a dog, 2 cats, a rabbit, a guinea pig, and a whole lot of other pets. So we are so happy to have you. Welcome, Nancy and Larissa. Thanks for making time to be with us today on Faith Unfiltered.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Oh, it is just a joy, I tell you. So I did share some professional bios in your introductions today, but not much on the personal level. So we'd like to take a little time to find out more about you, maybe a little background where you grew up, your family hobbies, favorite vacation spots. Maybe even you want to throw in a little known fact of special interest wherever you want to take it. Nancy, we'll hear from you first.
Sure. So I grew up in Augusta, Maine, and ended up in Scotland for my undergraduate degree and lived in the UK for a long time. After my husband and I got married in 2004, we moved to St. George, Utah, and we've been here ever since. I have two children who are now university students and living far away. So Robin knows and has met my kids. They are not all grown up, but they are well on their way to being grown up. And so we are fairly recently empty nesters here, which is a new stage of life that we are still adjusting to and getting comfortable with. And let's see, what else is interesting? I think all of my hobbies are work related, and so I am not a lot of fun. And so I have participated in the Mormon feminist movement for a really long time. And even though I identify as Community of Christ now, my Mormon feminist community is still really important to me, and I help organize some. I blog for the Exponent to blog, and I help organize a feminist. We've now renamed it our family reunion during the summers, and yeah. So that's a bit about me, Larissa.
Yeah, I'm laughing, Nancy, at you saying like all of your hobbies are work related. Because sometimes I'm like, is going to school my hobby that I do? Because I'm like always in school for something. So, but no, yeah. So I was born and raised in Utah, in Utah County, actually, which is a very, very heavily Mormon area of Utah. So I grew up there, and then I went to college at Weber State University for a little bit, and then transferred to the University of Utah, where I met my husband, and he was getting ready to go to medical school. So we actually left Utah and kind of traveled around. We lived in the Midwest, in Michigan, in Indiana, and then in Missouri during his like medical schooling. And so, and then he got a job in Nashville. And so we ended up in Nashville. And we've been here for about 12 years now. So this is kind of our spot. So yeah, we ended up in the South, which is interesting thing. But yeah, and we like my husband was going to medical school back before you could go to school online, and so like his career was really prioritized in the early part of our marriage, and I was at home with little kids, and then once we kind of got settled, we kind of switched and it was my turn, so I've been on kind of like my own journey right now. So anyway, yeah, so that's kind of a little bit about me and where how we got to be where we are. Yeah, I like Robin said, I have three kids. They're all adopted. So we have a multiracial family, which is something I has been very enriching for me. Um, and then yeah, my oldest actually just went to college. And so this was my first one out of the house. And so that's been an exciting transition for him. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything else. I'm a real food person. And so and the restaurant scene is really great, like in Nashville. And so I know people always like associate Nashville with country music, but there's like a cool art scene here. There's like really good food. And so I love like trying new restaurants. And I love music, so I'll like go to some concerts or things like that. So that's probably where my hobbies are they're either school related or food related is probably like most of what I'm doing with my life. So yeah, that's me.
Well, thank you all so much. I love getting to know our guests better. And I have known Nancy for a while, but I find when we have guests on, even people I've known for a while, I always hear something new, learn something new about that person. So thanks to both of you for sharing about your lives a bit with us. Okay, so the book, Mormon Garments, Sacred and Secret, releases February 24, 2026. That is not very long away. And I know that this topic has been a special interest of Nancy's for many years. And I'm aware that she and others have done loads of research connected with the Mormon experience and Mormon feminism. But tell us about your journey with this research and what led you as authors, as co-authors, toward writing this book. Was there a moment or experience in the midst of the research that was a goal? Perhaps it was a goal at the beginning. Um, and maybe a question that came up during the research that made it clear that a book was going to be written?
I'll go ahead and start, and I would love for Larissa to jump in because her journey has been, I think, in some ways parallel to this project. But she kind of intersects. She's the one who helped make this a reality. We are here today, excited for the release of this book in large part because of the energy and enthusiasm and experience that Larissa had. A long time ago, in 2013, Jessica Finnegan and I started doing research about Mormons online. I was a medieval art historian, teaching art history in an art department at that time. And it was really hard. It was before there were a lot of digitization projects because now, just about feels like just about everything you might need from the past is easily digitized and available online. But I was really struggling in my career to find kind of a foothold with research after my PhD. And Jessica asked me to do a project. We did a project. It worked really well. She and I worked really well together and became really good friends. And we were after that first project, we were like, what are we going to do next? And we're kind of discussing possibilities. And there were so many conversations in the kind of golden age of Facebook groups way back when, in groups like Feminist Mormon Housewives Society. And whenever garments came up, those threads would just run into hundreds of comments. I would be like eager, like eating popcorn and, like metaphorically, like eating popcorn and reading through the threads, learning about all these other experiences that were both similar to and different from my own garment wearing experiences. And I had a strong feeling at that time that my garments felt really uncomfortable, but I couldn't even just, when I tried to like unpack that for myself, I certainly understood that my garments were physically uncomfortable for me, but it felt like that discomfort was more than physical. And I'm like, I don't even know what this is about. So Jessica was like, well, we're going to do a survey. And so we decided to do a survey. At that point, Mormons had not been surveyed in social media very much at all. And so when we dropped the survey, within a week, we got 4,500 responses. We had hoped for 500 responses. We had hoped to write a journal article about it, like one journal article, and then move on with the rest of our lives and be normal people. And that was not possible. We had so much data that we didn't actually have the tools to be able to process that much data and know exactly how to begin to work our way through it because the quantity and the quality was just so much. And when people take surveys, they rarely write in the box because nobody has time for writing in the box. And people like poured their hearts out in the box. And it was immediately super overwhelming for us. We're like, how do we get a tidy, short journal article out of all of this data, which is so much more complex than we had like the skills and knowledge to really work through. And we attempted a number of different journal article versions of that survey. Last year, I printed out a stack of all of the rejections we received. People don't often talk about their rejections in academia or their, career failures, but we had basically a huge stack of rejections about why, ranging from this is an offensive topic, how dare you, to, you've got some really good data here, but you need to sit with it a little longer and be able to figure out what it means. And we were like, dang, we do need to be able to figure out what this means. And then at some point, after so many rejections, we decided that this was not a journal article, that we couldn't fit everything we needed to explain in garments into a journal article. And it wasn't really a series of journal articles. It was a book. And so, and then when we were like very much exhausted with the project already, it was kind of the decision to write a book and for which we had no experience for writing a book. and did it all wrong several times. Sorry, this is a very long version of it's, but I feel like this project has been an odyssey of like learning and adventure, where the adventure has highs and so many lows. And there were points in which we had to put down the project because reading through the really hard stories was frankly just so heavy and kind of traumatic, and brought up our own issues. And then we'd have to stop and go to therapy and work on our own issues and then come back to the project. And so this for me has just been like this like never ending epic adventure I could have never anticipated. It's been wonderful. It's been terrible. And I am so excited to be bringing this thing to publication. Before I met Larissa, I knew what I needed to do. I had written a first draft. I had had some research assistance. I'd received a grant. I'd had feedback from a wonderful friend and colleague, Liberty, on the first draft. And then I needed to like fix it. And I was like totally depleted. I was like, I don't know how to. And Jessica had moved on with her life and needed to work on other things. And I was just like, I know what I have to do. I do not have the energy and like the inner resources to do this on my own. I went to Sunstone, that wonderful, bringer of all the strange things together. And I heard Larissa speak about her project on garments. And I was so excited during that presentation because you had such a good understanding of so much of what I had been wrestling with for such a long time. And then after I think it was like a week or so of thinking about it, I was like, I don't know her. I just need to reach out and see if she will jump on board, because I think she has a kind of energy and enthusiasm. Sorry. And so I will stop my long story and tag Larissa. Larissa, tell us about your journey with garments and how you came to work on this thing.
Yeah. So I came in a little later into this project. So like Nancy says, this is really the data is really like Nancy and Jessica's baby. And I always feel very grateful to be a part of this, because like Nancy and Jessica were doing this in the early days of even utilizing social media that was very early. And this is something that was not being talked about then. It's more out there now. There's more conversation. And so I really when I started doing my research, I cited their work before I even met Nancy, because I really saw them as pioneers in this type of work, especially with Mormon women. So I was raised in the church, so I had been a garment wearer, so I had worn garments. And then eventually kind of went through a faith transition and a deconstruction and separated from Mormonism. But obviously I feel quite a bit of camaraderie with other LDS women. And then became very, very interested in power structures that happen in institutions, which is why when I went back to school, I did gender and sexuality studies, because you really look at, social hierarchy and how it impacts how we relate to one another. So that was a really interesting thing for me. And I actually got interested in researching garments because I was in a class. My focus in my undergrad was had a justice and policy focus. And so we were actually learning about and discussing Islamophobia. And right around that same time, this woman, Masa Amini, an Iranian woman, she's Muslim Persian. She was killed in police custody. And it ignited a movement of protests that's still happening right now in Iran. And it was because she wasn't wearing hijab appropriately. So she actually was wearing it, but the front of her hair was showing. And so this was an institutionally enforced modesty law. and she was arrested for it, and then she died in police custody, and they have like scans that she was like beaten and there was head trauma. And so I was like really following this, both because it was, like I care about this. This is a huge women's issue. And it was just so relevant. And so as I started watching this, I just kept saying, like, I don't know why LDS women do not have a say in this. This is so relevant. It's so globally, like important for us to have these conversations about how women negotiate gender and religion. And I was like, LDS women, their voice needs to be heard in this, because they also do this. They negotiate their gender and their religion and the religious like aspects like clothing. And so like I was like, why aren't we talking about LDS women? They have something to say. Is there a platform for them to say this? And so anyway, so I ended up doing like a research project, and I think it was similar to Nancy's experience where, like I put things out there. I tapped into some like a few like Mormon influencers, which we know there's always like some like Mormon influencers that like will do their thing. And I had a huge response. And I think both Nancy and I's research really shows that like they're like people want to have their story heard and their voice heard. And there hasn't really been a formal way to put that out there. And so a lot of women were taking to like social media, comment sections, but there was some sense of really people wanting to like somebody to like bear witness of like what they're experiencing. So yeah, so that's how I got into it. So I have like kind of a separate research project that I did. It's a little different, but like a lot similar to the work that Nancy and Jessica did. So there was a lot of crossover. Mine kind of looked at like how it impacts a body image, where the wearing of like this religious garments, body image, and then also does it impact how you relate to your own sexuality? Because there are narratives around sex and sexuality that are tied to garment wearing. And so that's kind of was my focus of my research. And then I presented this research. I presented at Sunstone that summer, and then I met Nancy right after, and then she contacted me a little bit later. And so I think I was very I was new in my kind of like my own garment journey. And so I feel like I was just like, yes, we're going to do this. And it's so interesting. And actually there's one part that I think I wrote it in like in the book. We each kind of have an intro where we each talk about like kind of how we kind of like understand and relate to garments. And there's part of what I wrote in the book is that, people have jokingly called them like, is this magic underwear? And my take is that garments tell a story of what's happening culturally within Mormonism, possibly more than any other item. And so in that way, they are kind of like magic underwear because it is so rich with like history and narratives and like messages about body and identity and anyway, it's so I find this to be like one of the most interesting aspects of Mormon religious practice. And so, so I was like, kind of just like, yeah, I'm here, I'm ready. So I like dove right in, and Nancy and we worked really hard to kind of like rework, rewrite, touch things up. We edited, we did a lot of things together. And so I feel like I came in like a little bit later, but when I came in hard. So that's kind of like my experience, like getting in on this project.
No, and it was definitely, I felt like by the time that Larissa came on board, I had run like 3 marathons with Jessica. And it was just like, but like we must get across the finish line. And Larissa definitely brought so much energy and enthusiasm and hard work that helped us get across that kind of brought this thing to completion. And what Larissa hasn't said is that her own work and her own survey sample do a much better job than my sample. So my sample is like men and women, and Larissa's sample focuses on women, but Larissa's sample includes a huge population, a huge group of like women of color, which is broadly missing in the book that we're about to publish. And I look forward to Larissa publishing on women of color in garments, because I feel like this will add so much richness to the bigger, broader discussion of garments that will, I think, further our conclusions, even take the conversation we have begun here with this book and then run with it a further distance. So she has done some really important work here.
That is just fascinating. And what a journey. I mean, it sounds like an initial survey, it was like opening Pandora's box, and it just was astronomical in proportion. As you said early on, there's no way this was going to fit into a tidy journal article or something of that nature. Wow. And you've touched on a lot of things as you talk about that journey that we're going to go into deeper. That brings me to this next question. So we want to hear more about the research process and what the research told you about how the religious requirement for faithful adult Mormons to wear garments under their clothes day and night, how that impacts their lived experience. And as I said, you've touched on that a little bit, but I really want you to drill down into that. And it's fascinating, Nancy, your initial survey was male and female. Larissa has focused on the female experience and also brought in women of color, which is going to be a really, really important dynamic to hear. So I'm looking forward to your work being published in that area, Larissa. So take it away and just drill down however deep you feel we need to go.
So when we were when Jessica and I were creating the survey, and I think that this is probably the tension that was, inspiring Larissa to a certain extent. We know that, men are the gatekeepers and decision makers of what garments look like and how the practice is defined. And of course, in all Joseph Smith churches, ideas about priesthood and authority are really important. And in Mormonism, then priesthood leaders and really a fairly small group of people have like the power to kind of name the norms and expectations around particular religious practices. And so and this is a daily religious practice for so many adult LDS church members. And so what the data really showed was that, and our hypothesis was that, like, men and women are going to have very different experiences, but men's experience, and it was a very simplistic hypothesis, but we knew that that a survey would complicate it. Like men would have an easy time and women would have a hard time. And that was kind of what we were in a sense, what we wanted to communicate. And what we found was that men and women have a hard time with their garments, and often for different reasons. And then we were trying to figure out, using what we would say is an intersectional approach. How do we understand not only one intersection of identity as having an impact on how people experience their garments, but how do we begin to understand more than one? I'm kind of using my hands here to create, in my mind, there's like a circle or a pie with so many pieces, and all different pieces of identity that an individual might hold. Maybe their race, maybe their gender, maybe their class, maybe their sense of national origin, the languages they speak, their disability or disability, neurodivergence, and all just a whole collection of senses of identities. And we were trying to figure out, from the survey we had conducted, which identities were relevant in helping us to explain people's different experiences, because we really we expected women to have a broad range of experiences with their garments, but we really didn't expect men to have a broad range of experience. And that was immediately very confusing. Why do men have a difficult time with their garments? I can understand, there's a laundry list of women's issues with garments, but I don't understand why men are having a hard time with their garments. And then it's like, well, what other identity piece helps us understand like these different ranges? And what we realized, and what some other scholars, including Mormon studies scholars, specifically Chung-Wang Chen and Ethan Jorgensen, had talked about, was the idea that within LDS, within Mormon communities, our relationship to belief and institutional belief is like its own intersection of identity, which may not be as relevant in other kinds of traditions, but it's something in Mormonism and the LDS Church that is tested pretty regularly through temple recommend questions, where many other traditions might have a set or standard of belief that they adhere to. People aren't necessarily interrogated and then judged in some way about their measures of belief. But LDS people are really, from childhood onward, interrogated in a one-on-one setting with priesthood leaders about the degree to which our beliefs conform or don't conform to community norms. And so that made, in many respects, because we would say that the LDS Church has an embedded belief test, where belief has been a difficult thing for sociologists to study, because, if someone outside of Community of Christ were to come in and try to determine what appropriate Community of Christ belief is, and then measure that, you can just imagine, Robin, what a disaster nightmare. The conclusions would be so off, because that is not how Community of Christ operates. There's no embedded belief test, right? That's just not how things work. But because the LDS Church does have this embedded belief test, then you can and that's meaningful within the community. Then from a sociological framework, you can kind of ask people or similar questions and kind of use that. And we had asked a number of belief questions in our survey, which kind of looked like temple recommend questions. And so Jessica and I were able to create what we refer to as a belief index for each person, and effectively dividing the responses and understanding that people's stories with garments were meaningfully different if they experienced doubt in the LDS Church beliefs, or if they didn't experience doubt. And there were many finer gradations of belief that we saw, but effectively having strong belief in all of our categories versus experiencing doubt in any of the questions and maybe not having firm belief in any of the categories, that these were fundamentally significantly different experiences. And in order to avoid there's lots of loaded language in Mormonism around people who are worthy or not worthy, or good enough or good members, or we were trying to avoid naming these two different groups of people who experience doubt and people who don't experience doubt. We kind of came up with some fairly technical language, like conforming believers being people who don't experience doubt, and non-conforming believers, meaning people who did experience doubt. And not necessarily doubt in all areas, but rather some doubt together with some belief. There were very few people who didn't believe at all in our survey. I'm not sure we had any people who didn't believe at all in our survey, but rather that belief is just a complex picture. And it's really what we saw is that our identities around gender, and again in our survey, because I think Larissa's survey would show more fine grain in regard to gender and race, but gender and belief were really significant for us. And that when we then divided our survey responses in, using the belief index and using somebody's gender identification into conforming men and non-conforming men and conforming women and non-conforming women, we saw really different patterns emerge in these 4 different groups. And that is just like a really complicated and overly long explanation for some of what we learned. But one of the key things that we learned is that somebody's orientation to belief in Mormonism really shapes their experience and understanding of Mormonism in pretty profound ways. Sorry, that's like a very long answer of process, and then kind of, but like in really profound ways. It shapes their relationship to how they understand how they make their choices. And this is something that gets a lot of explanation in the book. Where conforming believers believe that they are fully empowered to make conforming choices that are all their own. Where non-conforming believers tend to understand that they exist in a system that wants to push them towards particular choices, and they see and name those structural pressures as being like a structural thing rather than an individual thing. And so that changes how they frame their choices and then their understanding of what choices they have. Sorry, that was a really long and complex answer. And I am like always one for getting lost in the weeds. So Larissa, can you add do you have anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, I think that's all. I think that's really important and core to like the belief index, or trying to understand, like how people relate to the church, and then how does that impact what their experience is. I would say one, just like another element that I think that came out of both of our research, and one thing that we try to talk a lot about too, is that there's like these 2 different things that we saw, where there is like within the LDS church, there's institutional regulation, and then but then there's a social regulation. And I think that that was just something that was so interesting, and we talk about this a lot too. I think this is one of the big themes of the book, is that how do garments function socially within the group as a way of like checking each other, assessing people, categorizing people, policing people. Like, they're used in all of these different ways. And I think for many people, both in my survey and I know in yours also, Nancy, is that they felt that the social regulation was actually more intense than institutional regulation. But the social like was born from the institute, like we get these messages from, like conference talks, or like from different statements that are made, and so that was where like the messaging kind of was born. But then the way that it took shape within the community was really a function of culture, right? Like the people, like it kind of like took on a life of its own. And so I think these are like some things that we try to do, is look at in the book of kind of like juxtaposing these different like concepts and how we look at them. But I think that'll always be one of the most interesting things for me that hit me, that came out of this, doing this type of research, was understanding the difference between there was institutional things happening, but then a whole thing that was going on socially, and how is that impacting how women relate to each other within the church. And I'm I'm a psychologist in the making, and so I think that one thing that I feel like it's almost my biggest concern when I talk about LDS women in garments is I'm okay with everybody wearing garments, and I'm never going to be someone that says like you shouldn't wear those. That's a system of control. Like, I think people find meaning. I think the thing I always am like so shocked about, that I want to talk about, is that women within the church invalidate other women because of how they wear it. And I know that in my work there were people who messaged me and said, I hope you're not interviewing like progressive Mormon women because they all hate their garments. That's not a good representation of us. Meaning that us is devout believers, right? Like the conforming believers that Nancy talked about. And somehow progressive Mormon women are not part of the us. And so I was like, this is so interesting that like we're even within the church. And then you've got groups of women that have left the church that identify as ex-Mormon. And do they have a say? Like, do they have a say in how their garments impacted them? And so it's just, I feel like the way that these function socially is always so interesting. And then how women relate to each other, whether they understand each other or invalidate each other or police each other, is always something. I think it was just something that came out of the research that was so fascinating to me. And I think it will always be one of like my key things that is so, so interesting is this, how does this impact us relationally, like within communities, outside the community, like because of the narratives around garments and the different ways that people relate and find meaning with them. So that's the only thing that I would add that was something that I feel like always is a standout for me when we did this research and when we look at the comments and the data.
And if I can just build on that just a little more, because I think that social piece is just huge. And I think that that's going to be really new for a lot of readers who might understand garments, especially if they're coming from an LDS background and maybe they are conforming believers. They might understand, well, garments are about me and my choices. They're not about other people and other choices, but they really are about, it's a social system. And that is such an important piece of this book. For me personally, what hit me hardest in the research was like the social system piece. And then you have like what happens to people in their relationships with their bodies that emerge because they're required to wear a particular kind of underwear that somebody else has chosen for them. And then that like body piece and how we tend to think of belief, coming back to this kind of initial idea that I talked about. Belief is like something that happens in our brains and like with ideas that we like agree to or we disagree. But then how belief ends up living in people's bodies. And then when you have a really embodied spiritual practice, like wearing garments, how the needs of the body and the comfort of the body, like really create not just a physical friction with underwear, but like a spiritual and belief friction with underwear. Where if you might be like many people told us stories where they started off as conforming believers and many factors, but including the wearing of garments, became like physically uncomfortable and then spiritually uncomfortable. And then that changed, like that's associated with whether it's a driver of a causation of or not, but is associated then with like a change in their belief type. And so this way in which if we only hold the body as kind of like an abstract idea, which many men hold their bodies as, right, like, and the decision makers around what kinds of garments and what patterns are okay and how should garments be worn, if all of those people kind of never have to like consider comfort because garments are really structured around developments in men's underwear. So, they kind of fit men's needs and men's comfort needs, and women often have different needs with their underwear, and women's bodies often change shape very significantly through the natural stages of life, and men's bodies change shape too. But menstruation, lactation, pregnancy, menopause, right? Like all these things impact women's bodies in very significant ways. And if literally none of these things are really accounted for, and then women express physical discomfort, in Mormon communities, expressing physical discomfort with garments is a sign of like deep spiritual failing as a person. And how then the kind of social policing and the individual experience can really come into very difficult tension. And I would say that even Larissa and I have both left more, neither of us are practicing Mormons anymore, right? Like that these tensions linger in the body for a long time. And it's not something that just like dissipates with time. It's something that feel like I have to work really hard to like unpack what wearing garments did to me and to my body and to my sense of like belief and agency and autonomy and sexuality and relationship to myself. And that is a really hard, that is something that has taken me 12 years to both figure out and then for myself, and then figure out how to see that in the data and how to understand that in the data, and then to be able to explain in words that is not just like a deep and painful ache in my body. And so when we talk about, and Robin, we have both been involved in, and right, like we've all been involved in former Mormon spaces for a long time, that this is a piece that is not obvious, that is absolutely pervasive, and it is very difficult to like the social piece and then the body piece, and how belief and expectations linger in the body. And because we've often grown up in these systems, like that our sense of self and our sense of body and our relationship with our bodies are formed within these systems of surveillance and control. And systems of surveillance and control of bodies exist right in all parts of our society. So we're not going to pretend that outside of being Mormonism, there's none of this, right? Like I'm a woman, I grew up in the 90s, right? Like there was a lot of, right? Like there were a lot of expectations about what bodies should look like, and that kind of thing. So I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but rather that the LDS Church and with garments has a very particular system of surveillance and control of bodies that often has really devastating consequences for people as they are trying to live their faith. And that this is a harm. Not everyone would describe wearing garments as a harm, but some of us are really going to describe this impact as a harm, and that is going to take like a lifetime of undoing. And while I agree with Larissa, right? Like we're not going to tell people, the book does not tell people not to wear garments. Like that is not useful for people who are conforming believers or struggling non-conforming believers, right? Like that is not useful, but rather that how we talk and understand experiences of agency, how we understand the experiences of social and religious pressure, how we understand, and if we understand God and God's expectations for us as living in and next to our skin in ways that for some are going to be deeply comforting and feel strong and positive and protective, that same mechanism can also be deeply destructive to belief and spirituality and to a sense of self and autonomy. Sorry, I just had to throw that in there.
No, thank you. Thank you. And I just want to affirm and hope you know how much I deeply appreciate your willingness, both of you, to be so open and transparent with this journey.
You've been listening to part one of a two-part No Filter episode with host Robin Linkhart and guests Nancy Ross and Larissa Kanno-Kindred. Watch for part two next Friday. Until next time, have a blessed day and find a way to be a blessing to someone else.